Let's break down every single running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end that you could possibly need to add last minute off of the waiver wire moving into week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Whether you're dealing with injuries, whether you have players that you just don't trust this week, or whether you're looking to stash some players, here are the players that you can add last minute before week 8 begins that might help you bring home a dub in week 8. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 8 NFL pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free NFL pick'em to use towards week 8 action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. It is not the best week if you need a spot play or last minute play at the running back position, but let's go through a couple names here. Let's start with Alexander Mattison. Every single waiver video of the week, beginning of the week, and last minute waiver video. So far on the season, we've talked about Alexander Mattison. He is a little bit higher overall roster percentage at this point in time, sitting at 69% roster, but he's still under 70% rostered, and I think a big part of that going into week 8 is because he has a god-awful matchup, the worst matchup he could ask for, against the Kansas City Chiefs, the team allowing the fewest fantasy points to the running back position. But Alexander Mattison, for majority of the season, has been a player that we can start on a week-in, week-out basis. He only has single-digit fantasy points in 2 games on the season, and in one of those games, he did score a touchdown. So he's the RB22 right now in fantasy football, averaging 12.1 fantasy points per game, especially if you're struggling at the position, you have injuries, whatever. Madison is a player that you can pick up and at least roster for now. You don't have to start him in week 8. I don't recommend starting him in week 8 against the Chiefs, but he's going to be, in matchups the next coming weeks. Next week against the Bengals, a bye week in week 10, but then the Dolphins in week 11. There are good upcoming matchups. Week 16, Jacksonville. Week 17, the Saints. 2 very strong matchups in the fantasy playoffs. So if Madison is out there, I don't like starting him this week unless you're desperate. He's going to get RB1 volume, even with Zamir White now looking like he's back and everything. But you'd have to be really desperate to start him against the Chiefs this week. But overall, he should be rostered. He's a good player to have on your bench moving forward. So this is the time to go ahead and add Alexander Mattison. And I don't know, maybe he drops in roster percentage after this week, after he plays against the Chiefs. Overall, he should be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues as we approach week 8. And next up, let's talk about D'Ernest Johnson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And D'Ernest Johnson is really only a play, of course, if Travis Etienne is out in week 8. So at the time I'm recording this, Travis Etienne is still listed as questionable for Sunday, dealing with that hamstring injury. And it's not the best matchup this week against the Green Bay Packers, so we want to keep that in mind as well. But it's also not an awful matchup as they're allowing the 18th most fantasy points to the running back position. So not necessarily a smash matchup. They're kind of right there in the middle. But D'Ernest Johnson, nonetheless, can see some involvement in the passing game like we've seen over the last 3 weeks. He walked away with 10 fantasy points in week 7 against the Patriots, 6.4 in week 6. He at least gets some involvement with Tank Bigsby as the RB1 on this team, that if Etienne is out this week in a competitive game script where we should see points, I think, from both sides, but especially from the Packers, where the Jags are going to be playing from behind, and maybe we see D'Ernest Johnson involved in the passing game, maybe he's a guy that we can plug in and play as long as Travis Etienne is out this week. So we're going to have to monitor going into Sunday. Is Etienne out? Is he not? And if he is, then we can potentially play D'Ernest Johnson in this matchup if you're looking for a spot play at the running back position in week 8. All right, it is truly an awful week if you need a running back last minute. So let's talk about 2 stashes. Let's start with Kendre Miller, sitting at 13% rostered, saw 6 touches against the Broncos last week, 36 rushing yards, and added 3 targets for 2 receptions and 1 receiving yard. So technically speaking, in week 7 against the Broncos, he led the team in rushing yards. I'm not going to read too much into that, as Alvin Kamara is easily the RB1 on this team. But it is worth noting that, I mean, Alvin Kamara has been dealing with a hand injury, a broken hand. He's had a rib injury. And I mean, this is still Kamara's backfield, don't get me wrong. But of course, if Kamara were to miss any time, then while some may argue that Jamal Williams is the RB2 here, right now the depth chart is looking as if Kendre Miller's the RB2. So he's a good handcuff, good stash. I mean, of course, we could also see a scenario where if Kamara misses time, then we see both Miller and Jamal Williams in a committee. But there are some good upcoming matchups. Week 9, the Carolina Panthers, the Rams in Week 13, the Raiders in the Fantasy Championship, and a couple other semi-soft teams in between. So Kendre Miller, nothing more than a stash, but if you're looking to stash a running back, Kendre Miller is a player that could come on as the season progresses if Alvin Kamara were to miss any time. All right, just one more running back. We have some options to go over, but this week we just don't. So let's talk about one more stash, and that's Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens, who has not played at all so far on the season. So the stats you see on the screen are actually from last season, but he has returned to practice after missing the entirety of the season so far. He is still technically listed as on the PUP list. I don't know if that's going to change, but for some of you guys right now, you might be able to pick up Keaton Mitchell sitting at 10% rostered and move him to your IR spot, but he probably won't be there very long. So the expectation is that he should be back in the next week or two. And Keaton Mitchell, I mean, a player who had double-digit fantasy performances 4 times last year in 8 games. So I know that he brings a lot of upside to the table. Definitely a very different style running back than Justice Hill. And Justice Hill is still going to be involved in this offense. And yeah, every week, Justice Hill, I mean, sits at 35% rostered. He's always a running back that you can plug and play and cross your fingers for some points like we saw in week 7, but very, very volatile. It'll be interesting to see how Keaton Mitchell is exactly utilized within this offense. But what we do know is that this is one of the best offenses in the league. They want to run the football first and foremost, and we haven't really seen any evidence that they need to spell Derrick Henry at all, or that Henry or Lamar Jackson at the quarterback position, still running the football for Lamar, are going to need to be, spelled for any reason. They both seem like they absorb hits very well, and Lamar misses hits and gets out of bounds very well. But you never know, and I mean, the season's going to continue to progress here and start to maybe cause some more wear and tear. So maybe we start to see more touches to running backs like Justice Hill or Keaton Mitchell once he's active. Nothing crazy. It's still Derrick Henry's backfield, but it'll definitely be interesting to see how a player like Keaton Mitchell, once he makes his NFL debut for the season, is utilized. So I think he's a good stash, mainly because he's tied to the best offense, arguably, in the entire NFL, but more importantly, a run-first offense at that as well. So nothing more than a stash here as we prepare for Keaton Mitchell to make his NFL debut for the season. Certainly a player worth looking at as we approach Week 8. Let's move along to the wide receiver position, and let's just go ahead and talk about both of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers that I think are worth rostering right now, and that would be Jalen McMillan as well as Sterling Shepard. So, I mean, there's not like a ton that I want to break down here because you guys have heard about this all week long. We talked about this in the early waiver wire video, but right now we've got Jalen McMillan up to 57% roster. Then we've got Sterling Shepard sitting at 38% rostered. So no Mike Evans this week. Mike Evans will not be back until after the Week 11 bye, Week 12 matchup against the Giants, barring any setbacks. Chris Godwin out for the season. So what do we have here? Well, listen, I think Rachaad White's going to get plenty of targets. Bucky Irving is going to play this week, but he is dealing with a foot injury. I think Rachaad White's going to be a big part of the game plan against the Falcons. And then, as many have alluded to throughout the week, Cade Otton at the tight end position is going to get plenty of target volume overall as well. But somebody at wide receiver is still going to have to step up in a very pass-heavy offense for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The last time we saw them play Atlanta in Week 5, Baker Mayfield actually threw for just 24 total passing attempts, but outside of that, he has 30 or more passing attempts in every game except for week 2 against Detroit. But overall, we saw an aggressive game script against the Falcons in week 5, right? So somebody's got to step up here. I still lean with Jalen McMillan, but I'm not going to be surprised if Sterling Shepard gets pretty heavily involved as well. Now, Shepard just 1 target, 1 reception in week 7 against Baltimore. McMillan, 8 targets, 3 receptions, 5.6 fantasy points compared to Shepard's 4.5 fantasy points. Sterling Shepard had a 2-point conversion in that game as well. So listen, a little bit of risk here. I'm not going to go crazy and say you guys need to start either of these players. I think McMillan is the better start. It's just my guess. We'll see. Atlanta been pretty soft against the wide receiver position, coming in as giving up the 21st most fantasy points to the position, so not a bad matchup here. We'll see what happens, but I think both players are worth rostering. But just keep in mind, too, week 9, it's a bad matchup against the Chiefs for these wide receivers. Then week 10, they get the Niners at home. I'm okay with that. But then they get a bye week in week 11, and then Mike Evans is expected to be back in week 12 against the Giants, which is certainly going to eat into the potential production of McMillan and Shepard. But if you're desperate, you're looking for flex plays, I do like McMillan and potentially Shepard in this matchup against the Falcons in week 8. All right, another young wide receiver who's going to get some opportunity due to stud wide receivers being out is going to be Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, who was shot up to 52% rostered after having 5 targets, 3 receptions, 21 receiving yards, and 5.1 fantasy points in week 7. So this is what we've got for week 8. We've got Deebo Samuel listed as questionable versus Dallas. I will like Ricky Pearsall more if Deebo plays, less defensive pressure. But on top of that, we've got Jawan Jennings out with that hip injury. He's now at 73% roster, just still be rostered, but he's not going to play this week. Then we've got George Kittle, uncertain, listed as questionable in week 8 against Dallas. So, I mean, there's a lot going on here. Christian McCaffrey could be back in the next couple of weeks. What do we do with the San Francisco 49ers players with Jacob Cowing in his rookie season also looking as a potential add, sitting at 3% rostered? Well, like I said, I like the idea of, playing or starting Ricky Pearsall more if Deebo's out there. Obviously, the volume will be better if Deebo's not out there and Jennings not out there. Maybe Kittle's not out there, but then, even though Dallas has been struggling, it's like the defensive pressure is going to go to just one player and a rookie wide receiver. I don't know how I feel about that. So, listen, Pearsall worth adding, whether Jawan Jennings is healthy moving forward or not. This team really needs this week 9 bye week. But ultimately, we're going to see some nice opportunities for Ricky Pearsall either way here. He's got to be involved. Someone's got to step up. This is similar to Tampa Bay, where just somebody has to get the volume, somebody has to catch passes, and therefore they're going to be somewhat fantasy relevant. It's just how high does that ceiling become with these opportunities is hard to say. So Ricky Pearsall, definitely worth adding. Great prospect coming out of college. A lot of people in the Dynasty community like Ricky Pearsall a lot going into the season. And there's going to be opportunities here. We don't need to break it down extensively. We all know what's going on here. But he just sits at 52% rostered, especially if you're desperate enough with all of these injuries potentially piling up. The Cowboys come in 18th against the wide receiver position in terms of fantasy points allowed. Could certainly see an interesting, maybe low ceiling, but pretty safe fantasy day for Ricky Pearsall in week 8. And next up is Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys, sitting at 34% rostered on bye week in week 7, so got dropped in a lot of leagues, and just 8.3 fantasy points in that blowout in week 6 against the Lions at home. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 43 receiving yards. But don't forget, before that week 6 matchup against the Lions, Jalen Tolbert had double-digit fantasy points in 3 out of the first 5 games on the season. He's still averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game. Has this kind of nice matchup we just went over against the Niners this week. We're giving up the 15th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Not great, but not awful. And at the end of the day, this is still a wide receiver 2 on a team that is going to find themselves in a lot of positive game scripts when it comes to fantasy football, right? We look over the next couple of weeks for the Cowboys, the Niners this week, but then the Falcons, the Eagles, the Texans, the Commanders, the Giants, the Bengals, the Panthers, the Bucks, the Eagles. These are all either soft matchups that are good for the wide receiver position, or just good game scripts overall. And the Cowboys do this. They have that doomsday game every season in the middle of the season where they get blown out against a real playoff contender. And then they start, kind of on this march against soft teams. And whether they're winning those games or not, they do put up points in the regular season, right? So Brandon Cook's still out at the moment on IR dealing with that knee infection. No idea when he's going to be back, but as long as he is out, Jalen Tolbert is secure as a wide receiver 2 on this team. Like I said, a lot of good matchups coming up. I certainly think he's worth rostering, even if you're not going to start him here in week 8. I really like Jalen Tolbert's current line on Underdog, sitting at just 36.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in every game this year except for 2 games. It's a pretty decent matchup against the Niners, but I also like this game script against the Niners where I think the Cowboys are going to need to throw the football, and we're going to see a good competitive bounce back offensive performance out of the Cowboys. And Jalen Tolbert has hit this line in 4 out of the last 5 games. So I would straight to Underdog, hit the over on Jalen Tolbert's receiving yards. And don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are going to receive a free NFL Pick Em. Take your free Pick Em, take the over on Tolbert's receiving lines, and once that line hits, you're going to triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, next up is Rashad Bateman, who was one of the top ads last week that I wanted you guys to go over, was in the Sneaky Starts video for week 7, and he came through 22.1 fantasy points, just 4 targets, 4 receptions, but 121 receiving yards and a touchdown. He now has double digits in every game since week 3, except for that week 4 matchup against Buffalo, where quite frankly just wasn't needed. But I really like him here in week 8 against the Cleveland Browns. I really liked them last week as well. And this is just a good matchup against the Browns, who have been struggling in the past couple weeks defensively, and they come in 28th against the wide receiver position so far on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. But on top of that, we got Zay Flowers questionable going into the week. Now, I do like Bateman arguably more, once again, if Flowers is on the field, because I like the opportunity for wide receiver 2s or 3s more when the wide receiver 1's on the field and the defensive pressure goes to them, right? But once again, this Browns defense just does not scare me either way. And if Flowers misses this game dealing with that ankle injury, then Bateman could obviously come in as a wide receiver 1 here. Now, obviously, the Ravens are going to run the football. They're going to utilize Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely potentially, whatever. But they're still going to need to throw the football. And Bateman's either looking at a great matchup as a wide receiver 2 or nice volume as a wide receiver 1 if Zay Flowers misses this game. And maybe Zay Flowers does play, but he's more of like a decoy like he was last week, and then Bateman gets more involved for that reason. So overall, Bateman sitting at 42% rostered, I think, is a strong ad, part of arguably the best offense in the entire NFL. He's going to be a good spot play, flex play at times due to matchup as the season goes on. So I think he's certainly worth adding as we approach week 8. All right, next up is Demario Pop Douglas, who definitely left a sour taste in our mouth after week 7. This was a player that I really liked going into week 7. Great matchup, 21.2 fantasy points in week 6, but just could not play in week 7. Started the game and just couldn't finish the game. It is what it is. 3 targets, 2 receptions, 14 receiving yards, but they were drawing up plays to get Douglas the ball early in that week 7 matchup against Jacksonville. I still think if he played a full game, he probably would have had double-digit fantasy points. Drake May is throwing the football very well right now. Jets defense still allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position overall, but I still think, this is going to be a pass-first offense with Drake May at quarterback now. And yeah, maybe it's not the best matchup this week, but the Jets have also struggled against slot wide receivers, which at times are still lining up Demario Douglas in the slot. And I really just think if Pop Douglas had played the full game in week 7, we see a different fantasy stat line, then he would be higher roster going into week 8 and viewed as a wide receiver 1, which is what I still think he is. He's just sick and unable to play the full game in week 7. So there's some better matchups coming up as the weeks go on here. And I still think Demario Douglas in Drake May's rookie season is going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Patriots. So at times he's going to be a good spot play. nice player to have on the bench, a player that we can flex at times. So Demario Douglas, I get it. Week 7 was awful. Not great matchup this week, but he's still worth rostering as we approach week 8. All right, and speaking of players who have left sour tastes in our mouth so far on the season, let's talk about Dontavion Wicks of the Green Bay Packers, who comes in at 42% rostered and 13.8 fantasy points in week 7 after combining for 5.9 fantasy points in the previous 2 weeks. That huge week in week 4, 24.8 fantasy points, and certainly is not a player that we can trust as the season progresses, but he's got some great matchups. This is a great offense in the Packers that's going to throw the football first. Christian Watson is healthy, no longer dealing with that ankle injury. He's off of the injury report, but listen, we got Jaden Reed, we got Watson, we got Dobbs, we got Tucker Kraft, we got a run game with Josh Jacobs. There's going to be volatility. There's going to be inconsistency. But this is a smash matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Then in week 9, they get another good matchup against the Detroit Lions. This is a strong playoff schedule for the Packers in terms of fantasy football. The Seahawks, the Saints, and the Vikings in the fantasy playoffs. So there's going to be opportunity for Dontavion Wicks. Can we trust him? Probably not, but if you need a desperation play, you need an upside play, Dontavion Wicks is your guy. It's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard to actually throw him in your starting lineup, but this is a really good matchup this week, and I think he could pop off this week, but so could any of these Packers wide receivers, and I get it. None of you guys really want to hear about Dontavion Wicks, but there's going to be opportunity as the season goes on. He sits at 42% rostered. Like I said, he is the least rostered Packers wide receiver out of the bunch, but there's going to be times where he can pop and get you double-digit fantasy points. So for that reason, I still think he's worth rostering as we move into Week 8. Next up is Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos, a player that I've been talking about a lot throughout the week. Such at just 14% rostered, and we actually talked about Troy Franklin going into week 7 as well, where he had 10 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 50 receiving yards against the Saints. But you go back to week 5, he dropped a long touchdown pass, should have had a touchdown reception in that game. And then in week 6, 11.6 fantasy points, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Bo Nix coming into his own this rookie season, certainly not perfect, but having some moments, and this could be a week where Bo Nix and company, this Broncos offense, have some moments against the Carolina Panthers, arguably the worst defense in the entire NFL. It's a home game for the Broncos. They have struggled, or the Panthers have struggled against the wide receiver position so far on the season, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Don't forget Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, college teammates in their rookie seasons. I think that this chemistry is going to continue to blossom as the season progresses. They have a good matchup in week 9 against the Baltimore Ravens at secondary, giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far in the season. Bad matchup in week 10 on the road against the Chiefs, but then they get the Falcons, the Raiders, the Browns, a bye week, then the Colts, Chargers, and Bengals. For the most part, this is a pretty overall solid schedule for the Broncos as the season wraps up here. They might find themselves fighting for a wild card spot, and even not, I feel like this is a team in Bo Nix's rookie season that's just going to be trying to win as many games as possible. So I really like Troy Franklin. I think he's a great stash, and I think if you're desperate enough, he is a solid play against the Panthers in week 8. All right, last wide receiver I want to talk about is Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. Been a popular name as the week has started to progress here, sitting at 21% rostered. A big day in week 7 against the Bengals, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 81 receiving yards, 18.1 fantasy points, and a smash matchup this week against the Ravens. Like I said, just a minute ago, giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So there's certainly risk here. We saw a carousel of quarterbacks last week for the Browns with Deshaun Watson going down with Achilles injury, then Dorian Thompson-Robinson coming in and him leaving with the hand injury. And now it looks like Jameis Winston is the last man left, and he's going to be the starting quarterback in week 8 for the Browns. So there's definitely risk here. don't exactly know what to expect out of Jameis Winston as a starter in the year 2024, but he did throw a touchdown last week against the Bengals. It's a good matchup against the Ravens, who are also giving up a lot of fantasy points to the quarterback position. And it is worth noting that if Jerry Jeudy's out there in your league, I think Jerry Jeudy is worth adding as well. And Elijah Moore also had 10 fantasy points in week 7, but it feels like the player who has the most potential upside is Cedric Tillman. So I don't know if I'm going to start Cedric Tillman this week unless I'm absolutely desperate, but everything is lining up here for Tillman to be a spot play at times as the season progresses. And I think if you're desperate enough, I mean, you really could pick any Browns wide receiver to plug in here against the Ravens and cross your fingers. But the player that I'm taking the hardest look at is Cedric Tillman as we approach week 8. Moving along to the quarterback position, let's kick it off with Russell Wilson himself. And I talked about this going into week 7. Like, everyone's just making fun of Russell Wilson and why isn't Justin Fields starting? And my viewpoint was, I don't know, we might need to take a harder look at Russell Wilson. But I also said I was more interested in Russell Wilson if things are going well or look good in week 7 and or 8 after the bye week. And things certainly looked good in week 7 against the Jets, and now he gets the Giants, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. And after this week in week 9, the Steelers will get that bye week. Then they get the Commanders, the Ravens, the Browns, the Bengals, the Browns, the Eagles, the Ravens, and a bad matchup in the fantasy championship against the Chiefs. But that's a really strong schedule overall. A lot of good game scripts, soft defenses. Russell Wilson, as long as he remains a starter, is going to be a viable option in single quarterback leagues and especially in superflex and double quarterback leagues as the season progresses. So 24.9 fantasy points in his first start. I don't know if he's going to throw for 2 touchdowns and run for a touchdown every single game, but I certainly think like a safe floor of 17, 18 fantasy points with a ceiling of 25 fantasy points is very realistic for Russell Wilson. So I think he's a solid add. He sits at 30% rostered, and I think as the season continues to progress, that number is going to go up. So take advantage of things now, right? It was a bad matchup in week 7 against the Jets. He showed out, and honestly, it's still a good matchup against the Giants this week in week 8, but they've also had some games where they've shown up defensively. Then that bye week, week 9, is going to put a lot of fantasy managers in a bind. Like, am I going to hold on to Russell Wilson? Am I going to let him sit on the waiver wire? I think after this bye week in week 9, Russell Wilson and the Steelers are going to look very sharp. So take advantage of it now and add him as we approach week 8. All right, next up is Bo Nix, who we talked about earlier. He's had some moments this season for sure. 19 or more fantasy points in 3 out of the last 5 games. He's the QB 15 so far on the season, sitting at 31% rostered. And listen, the problem with Bo Nix is like he's getting it done on the ground. He's not always throwing for a ton of yards, not necessarily throwing for a ton of touchdowns. He's only thrown 5 touchdowns on the season. He's ran for 3. He's not really committing a ton of turnovers like he was early in the season, but that's expected with a rookie quarterback. And ultimately, I'm not going to trust him on a weekly basis, but here in week 8, he gets a fantastic matchup against the Carolina Panthers, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. They're struggling against the running back position, the wide receiver position, and the tight end position. One of the worst defenses in the league. So you need to spot play at quarterback. I really like Bo Nix this week. I mean, they gave up nearly 20 fantasy points to Marcus Mariota last week, right? And I think Bo Nix will be a spot play as the season progresses easily. I mean, it's a good matchup next week against the Ravens. Then you get a bad matchup against the Chiefs. Okay matchup against the Falcons, but then good matchup against the Raiders. Good matchup against the Browns. Like, there's going to be times where we can start Bo Nix. Also going to be a little bit tough to trust him at times as well, but ultimately he's kind of trending in the direction that he should be rostered, should definitely be rostered in Superflex double quarterback leagues. But there's going to be times if you're struggling at the quarterback position, maybe all you have is Patrick Mahomes and Anthony Richardson. Bo Nix might be a guy who can give your fantasy quarterback position some light as the season progresses. And I love Bo Nix's current rushing yard total line on Underdog, sitting at 29.5 total rushing yards. He has hit that in every game this year except for 3 games, and he has hit that in 3 out of the last 5 games as well in the last 2 games. This is an awful run defense for the Panthers, and I think if Bo Nix wants to, he can easily rush for 30 total rushing yards in this game. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Bo Nix's total rushing yards, and don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code The Catch are going to receive that free NFL Pick Em for the week. Take your free Pick Em, pair it with Bo Nix's rushing yards, and once that hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up with promo code The Catch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. And last but not least, I'm going to very quickly mention Matthew Stafford at the quarterback position. Obviously, it would have been helpful if you had him in Week 8 on Thursday Night Football. 5.7 fantasy points in Week 8, 4 passing touchdowns a pick, and 279 passing yards. The stats you see on the screen are just going into Week 7. That does not include Week 8. It was not updated. But it's almost nice to look at those stats and think about the fact that Stafford was only averaging 9.9 fantasy points per game through the first 7 games of the season. But just think about how different Matthew Stafford looked on Week 8. Just looked like the Matthew Stafford we know. Great touchdown passes, great overall game out of Matthew Stafford, but also this offense just looked completely different with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp back. So I think now is the time to pick up Stafford. If you're able to pick him up in your league before the next waiver wire period begins, go ahead and do so. Going to depend on your league. A lot of you guys won't be able to, but Stafford should be a top priority add as this week progresses and as we move into Week 9. Some good game scripts coming up. Week 9 against Seattle is the exact type of game script we're looking for if we're going to play Matthew Stafford. Week 10 against Miami. Miami's been really good against the quarterback position, but still feels like a good game for potential offense. Then New England, Philly, New Orleans, Buffalo, San Fran, the Jets, Arizona to finish out the year. And this Rams team really looking like they can piece together a couple more wins in the next couple of weeks. They're going to try and go on a real playoff run. So this looks eerily similar to what they did last year, but man, Stafford looked great in Week 8. If you're able to add him right now, absolutely do so. He should be rostered in more than 33% of fantasy leagues. Going into Week 7, we talked a lot about Cade Otton, mainly because Cade Otton had a fantastic matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, who have struggled against the tight end position, and he had 18 fantasy points, but those stem from Mike Evans essentially missing the entire game and somebody needing to step up. The game script was great here as the Bucs were playing from behind and needing to pass the football. Now Chris Godwin is also out for the entire season, so Cade Otton should be in line for plenty of volume. He has shot up to 68% rostered. He has 7.4 or more fantasy points in every game since Week 3, 9.7 or more in every single one of those games except for Week 5 against the Falcons. So I will say, while I like Cade Otton a lot and I think he should be rostered, and we've talked a lot about him, it's not particularly a bad matchup as the Falcons are giving up the 19th most fantasy points to the tight end position, but also, I think in terms of a defensive game plan, looking at the Bucs right now, I think they're probably going to realize we got to do something about Cade Otton, or that it should be expected that Cade Otton's going to see a lot of volume. So I would tamper expectations in a way here on Cade Otton until Mike Evans is back after the Week 11 bye, but I still think he's going to be a very solid player who's going to see plenty of volume. But I also think that the Bucs have a little bit more than maybe we think. They're going to have a good game in Bucky Irving. They're going to be able to throw to Rachaad White. They do have some wide receivers who I think can step up, but I also agree with the sentiment that Cade Otton's going to see plenty of volume. I'm also a little bit worried. I've seen some of you guys wanting to flex Cade Otton over skill position players, wanting to bench players like Mark Andrews or Dalton Kincaid, and I understand it to a degree, but I just want to be a little bit careful with Cade Otton going into the week, but ultimately he sits at 68% rostered. I do agree with his roster percentage going up, and I do think he should be rostered as we approach Week 8. And another tight end we talked a lot about last week was Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, who has moved up to 41% rostered. He's a tight end 9 so far on the season with 13.1 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games, 17.2 fantasy points in a smash matchup against the Jaguars in Week 7. So what do we do with Hunter Henry this week against the Jets, who are giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position? Well, I don't know if you have to start him necessarily, but I think he's a player that should be picked up, as rookie quarterback Drake May is certainly looking his way. I mean, 7 stat line wasn't just a product of the Jaguars being awful against tight ends, which they have been. It was also because Drake May was targeting Hunter Henry and finding Hunter Henry. I mean, didn't score a touchdown and had 17 fantasy points, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 92 receiving yards. He did score a touchdown in week 6 and had double digits then. But Henry, I think, is just going to be a player who is going to need to be rostered, a player that we can rely on at the tight end position as long as Drake May is starting. I mean, Hunter Henry traditionally kind of does this thing similar to what he did in week 2, where he shows up, has 18 fantasy points, then he disappears for the next 3 weeks. But I think this pattern is going to continue to be consistent. He might not be the highest ceiling or best play this week against the Jets, but overall, I do believe that Hunter Henry should be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues, and he's a player that we can pick up sitting at just 41% rostered at the time I'm recording this. All right, and last but not least, another tight end that we talked about a lot last week was Zach Ertz, and so we did pretty well on the last minute waiver ads at tight end or streaming options at tight end last week, and hopefully we do so again this week as Zach Ertz comes in at 40% rostered, 14 fantasy points in a great matchup against the Panthers in week 7, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But this week, it's a little bit of a tougher matchup as the Bears are giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So with that being said, I still like Zach Ertz a lot this week. He's a tight end 10 so far in the season. I do believe he should be rostered. And then we also have the, issue with Jaden Daniels and if he's going to play this week due to that rib injury or not. But Marcus Mariota was looking in the direction of Zach Ertz quite a bit. He was the one who threw the touchdown to Zach Ertz last week against the Panthers. He also threw a touchdown to rookie tight end Ben Sinnott. So apparently he likes throwing to the tight end position. Now, it's a much tougher matchup, a much better secondary in the Bears than what we got out of the Panthers last week. But Zach Ertz ultimately has been solid on the season. 8.5 fantasy points per game, the tight end 10 overall on the season. Less than 8.8 fantasy points in just 2 games so far on the season. So by tight end standards so far on the season, that is pretty good. So I just think he needs to be rostered. You got a, disposable running back or wide receiver on your bench. You only have 1 tight end. It's okay to roster 2 tight ends. Zach Ertz fits that mold. This is still going to be a great offense as the season goes on. Even if Jaden Daniels misses week 8, we can't, make all of our assumptions on this Washington offense based on 1 week. This is still a great offense when Jaden Daniels is fully healthy, so Zach Ertz definitely deserves to be rostered as we move in to week 8. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single player that you guys can add last minute off of the waiver wire moving into week 8 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach week 8, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, we have everything you could possibly need here on the channel for week 8 of 2024 fantasy football. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low targets, players that you can't bench, sneaky starts, as well as live fantasy Q&A streams throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.